Hello, everyone, and welcome to our anti-racist education event. I'm Kristen Luby, Marketing Manager for the Macmillan Children's School and Library team. Thank you all for joining us today for an important conversation about how to include fiction and nonfiction books in your anti-racist education work. As we head into the new school year, we want to thank every educator and librarian for continuing this important work in your community. And we hope today's conversation will be a useful resource as you create your curriculum and collections for the next year. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions during the event. The authors will be answering audience questions towards the end of the event. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance of the event. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Also, Booklist offers closed captioning on all webinars. To enable or disable captions on your screen, please look for and click the live transcript icon on the toolbar. From there, you can select show or hide subtitles from the menu that appears. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of the captions at any time by selecting subtitle settings. Last but not least, a link to today's title list was included in the reminder email you received from Booklist Zoom 1 hour ago. To download it, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and click on the link located there. You can also download the title list by copying the URL on this screen into your web browser. We know a lot of people requested an anti-racist reading list, and this document includes links to all of the books we'll be discussing today, as well as more recommendations for your collection, including picture books and middle grade recommendations. We can also share that link again in the Q&A box. If you just ask us in the Q&A box, we'll send the link again. Today's event will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you after the event. And now we're excited to introduce the moderator of today's event and our featured authors. Our moderator today is Julia E. Torres. Julia is a nationally recognized veteran language arts teacher librarian in Denver, Colorado. Julia facilitates teacher development workshops rooted in the areas of anti-racist education, equity and access in literacy and librarianship, and education as a practice of liberation. Julia's work has been featured on NPR, Al Jazeera's The Stream, PBS Education, QED's Mindshift, Rethinking Schools, Learning for Justice magazine, and many more. She is a current Amelia Elizabeth Walden Book Award committee member, a member of both the Book Love Foundation and Allen's Board of Directors, an EduColor Steering Committee member, the Educator Collaborative Book Ambassador, and a co-founder of Disrupt Text. Thank you for being here today, Julia, to lead this conversation. Our first featured author is Crystal Marie Fleming. She is an award-winning sociologist and writer. She is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at Stony Brook University. Crystal completed her PhD at Harvard University and publishes scholarly research on racial oppression and anti-racism. She is the author of an academic book on race and white supremacy in France, as well as the critically acclaimed book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, on racism, white supremacy, and the racial divide. Her work appears in Newsweek, The Root, Huffington Post, and more. Her newest YA nonfiction book, Rise Up, How You Can Join the Fight Against White Supremacy, will be available on October 5th. Welcome, Crystal. Thank you for joining us today. Next up, Bethany C. Morrow is an indie bestselling author who writes for adult and young adult audiences in genres ranging from speculative literary to contemporary fantasy to historical. She is the author of the novels Mem, A Song Below Water, and its companion A Chorus Rises, So Many Beginnings, a Little Women remix, which just went on sale yesterday, and the social horror book Cherish Farah, an editor-contributor to the young adult anthology Take the Mic, which was the 2020 ILA Social Justice and Literature Award winner. Her work has been chosen as Indie's Introduce and Indie's Next Picks, and featured in the LA Times, Forbes, Bustle, BuzzFeed, and more. She's included on USA Today's list of 100 Black novelists and fiction writers you should read. Thank you for being here, Bethany. And finally, last but not least, Amina May Safi is a Muslim American writer. Amina was the winner of the We Need Diverse Books short story contest, and that story appeared in the anthology Fresh Ink. She lives in Los Angeles, California with her partner and cat. Travelers Along the Way, a Robin Hood remix, is her fourth YA novel coming in March 2022. And her first three books were Not the Girls You're Looking For, Tell Me How You Really Feel, and This Is All Your Fault. Welcome, Amina. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Julia to begin our conversation. Take it away, Julia.
Hello, everybody. Really excited to be here with you. Thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for your books. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your time on behalf of our kids. and all people, right? Because YA doesn't just have to be for young folks, it can be for all ages. So before we really jump into the over 50 questions that I have in the document, we've got over 50 questions, and I was told that over 1,000 people registered for this. So we have a massive amount of, no pressure, but we do have a lot of folks who are listening to the words that we have to say about these exciting and important topics. I do want to preface things by saying that I'm at school. The bell did just ring. My office is underneath a ramp where kids run up and down. So if it gets really noisy, just holler at me in the chat and I'll mute myself, because there are people, over 2,000 people moving throughout this building, and that it is what it is. So let's jump right in. One of the first things that I want to make sure folks know is that, our work as librarians and language arts educators, literacy professionals, and even authors, our work of being anti-racist is ongoing, right? We need to recognize that attending a webinar or even a series of professional development is not going to be where the work starts and stops. So often events like this will kind of get into the mass consciousness as like, oh, okay, I'm going to attend this and then I'm going to be anti-racist. Or I'm going to get these books and include them in my collection and that will make me anti-racist. But we want to make sure that we recognize that there's a lot of work that goes into being anti-racist, and it's ongoing. That what is it, an affix, or what goes on the front, the prefix? Anti means that you're continually striving to fight all of the things that keep racist structures, policies, beliefs, practices in place. So the mere act of buying books and putting them in your library is not going to be the end all be all of being anti-racist, right? Before we began, Bethany, you shared some thoughts. Each of you shared some thoughts on anti-racism. So I would love to hear from you. Thoughts on anti-racism in general, and then how you think your work contributes to what educators or librarians or both need to do in schools to help us all as a society become more anti-racist.
I will not try to repeat what we were talking about before. Hopefully we will get back to it, but something that I do want to say as a student of sociology, which is what my degree was in, understanding the work of literature, the work of language, the power of language, but also understanding how difficult it is to deprogram, particularly from something that you have been inundated with, generationally for centuries. And the way that we have overrepresented one demographic and one narrative style even. I remember in 2020, right before A Song by the Water came out, I did a thread on Twitter that was talking about the fact that one of the things that happens is people get really excited to ingest and consume narratives and new books by non-white authors, and specifically in the summer of 2020 by Black American authors. And then something that happens really quickly can be this sort of backlash. And really what it is a cultural incompetence and a cultural illiteracy. People who did not know they were unprepared to understand and to actually properly metabolize the differences in narrative styles, in storytelling styles, in themes. We have all been taught how to ingest and how to properly process one way of thinking and one way of storytelling. And so one of the big things that I always say, and the reason that I'm so excited for Dr. Fleming to be here with us today, is that to prepare to read, I say to prepare to read non-white, and especially in my case, obviously Black woman fiction, you need to be pairing it with Black nonfiction. You need to be building that context so that you make sure that you're not bringing a whole bunch of confirmation bias and prejudice into the reading and suddenly making valuation judgments on something that you are not equipped to even necessarily metabolize and understand yet. So for me, something that I'm constantly telling people is when you come to read, especially So Many Beginnings, don't pair it with Little Women. That's useless. Pair it with Patricia C. Click's Time Full of Trial, which is a nonfiction scholarship on the life of the Roanoke Island Free People's Colony. Prepare yourself to be able to understand and enjoy and value these stories.
Bethany, I think that's such a beautiful segue into history too, right? Because reading the nonfiction history by authors of color is so important. Earlier in the chat, I was saying that anti-racist work is like Star Wars, which made everyone laugh, because it's like that ongoing saga of like beating the racism back, beating that like that control, that need for order, that need to express like that internal evil and darkness that's in everyone in that way that we've been indoctrinated in. But something you were saying, like, I was thinking about how you were talking about nonfiction to process what something means. And all I could think in my head was about the word jihad, which I know like everyone is gonna have this like, there's 1,000 people, I can't believe I'm saying this, they're like all gonna pull back, right? And like in Muslim terms, because to you, you've seen it on the news, you've seen it on the media, you've seen it in your mind, it means an extremist with a bomb strapped to them, blowing up a car, blowing up a holy site, blowing up people. Like we've just seen what was going on in Afghanistan. And it has all of this depth to you. To me, that word comes from the Quran, and that's like the lesser version. Like the idea of holy war is the lesser jihad. The greater one is this idea that we can strive and struggle in that transcendentalist way to be our greater selves. And that work is the work of a lifetime. And I kept thinking, like, I never bring up that word because I know people have a reaction. So I think understanding why that word might mean something different to someone who was raised in a faith that's different than yours, and what it means to them to see that on the news and to know that that means a polar opposite different thing, and that those words will have different meanings. And that is why I think Bethany's point about pairing it with nonfiction is so beautiful. And that's kind of that's what I was thinking about while you were, I was just like, I had an answer, but now I just want to like jam.
Yeah, I am so appreciative of your adding context to the conversation, right? Because understanding context is going to be essential. And of course, we have Dr. Fleming here to talk with us about real life and about nonfiction and about how that contributes to our understanding of context when we are bringing fiction into the classroom.
Yes, thank you. First, I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and specifically my co-panelists and Julia, Booklist. This is just a real honor for me to be in conversation with you. And I'm so excited about your books as well. So yay. So context is incredibly important. Bethany and I have a sociology background in common. I'm a sociologist. But people are sometimes surprised when they find that my work as a sociologist draws so much on history. And some people are a little surprised when they pick up whether it's How to Be Less Stupid About Race or Rise Up that's coming out next month. And they're like, wow, I didn't expect there to be so much history here. And if you don't already understand why you need to understand history in order to challenge and dismantle racism, you're part of the problem. And you need to educate yourself. And the books that we're discussing today are part of that process, but it's not the end of that process, right? It's like super basic stuff that you need to understand the connection between the past and the present in order to build a more just and inclusive future. And that's one of the main lessons I try to convey in Rise Up for young people to understand. It's not just a matter of looking at the past, but really thinking critically about how the headlines we still see on a daily basis about the persistence of white supremacy, how that's rooted in ongoing histories, and that we have to understand those histories from diverse perspectives, but especially from the perspectives of Black people and Indigenous people and people of color who have been a part of fighting white supremacy. And that last part is important. Because as much as we need to, and I totally agree, we need to think critically about what voices have been excluded from curricula, what perspectives, what knowledge gets centered, et cetera. It's not enough to sort of treat your curricula like a crayon box. And now we put a black author in, a brown author in, we get a multiracial. No, because we also have to think about how knowledge and how perspectives can reinforce racism even when they're expressed by a Black person or person of color. I don't want to pick on Kanye West, but we know Kanye, for example, saying things like slavery is a choice, right? That is a rhetoric that reinforces anti-Blackness. So these things go in tandem. It's not either or. We should definitely be diversifying the perspectives that are taught in our classrooms, but we also have to think critically about how all knowledge is political, think about the consequences of the perspectives and the ideas that we teach. And again, in my work, what I'm trying to do is center the knowledge and perspectives of anti-racists, people who have been challenging white supremacy, especially Black folks and Indigenous people and people of color, but also white anti-racists who are also a part of this history as well. So that's why context matters.
I really appreciate that you brought that up, because I actually did not have a lot of instruction during my school years that I can say that I didn't have any in middle or high school that I would consider anti-racist. And, you know, you certainly don't label a book anti-racist unless it's directly talking about anti-racism. It's the action of what you do when you bring that book into the classroom and analyze it critically, or have a book club where you encourage young people to have those critical conversations. That's when, you know, it is taking part in the process of becoming anti-racist.
Mm-hmm.
But a book itself, of course, you know, it is what we do with the book that brings it to life. So I want to talk a little bit about the books that you all read and learned with when you were in school, and then these books and those that our young people are reading now. Because a lot of, I believe part of the reason that I was brought into this conversation is because I am a part of a lot of critical conversations with librarians and language arts teachers, questioning what we teach young people in school and the books that we use to help teach them about the craft of writing and storytelling. There's often been a lot of conversation about the so-called classics, and I'll let you all elaborate more about that. But you know, what is the time or space when we realize that we need to make room for new stories and maybe relegate some of the older ones to a place where folks can read about them after they've left K through 12 education? I guess what I'm asking is, if someone were to ask you what is worthy of academic study about your text, what would you say? And also, I know this is a really long question. My students hate it when I do this, but really it's just two parts that I'm trying to get to. If students are going to learn with your books in school now, what would you say is worthy of academic study? And what inspired you to write these books and not bring the older stories back again and again and again? I guess that's not the best way to phrase it, but does that make sense?
I think I understand the question. I don't know how good or how well I'm going to
Thank you for trying
answer
to
it.
find out.
But
We're grading you. It's a panel of teachers.
I did a terrible job with that question, but it was a two-parter.
We just wanted to make a laugh so we could all just be like, no pressure.
Old and new, thinking old and new.
Yes, I have to say that something that I recognize is that I am a lot more at what would be considered aggressive than a lot of people want to be, and I don't think that it is appropriate to be tepid about this. So I don't think that it's appropriate to be like, okay, well, let's also coddle this this hierarchy that we've created. Let's be beholden to these feelings, to the attachment. Basically, what you're asking is like, let's take care with people who are attached to this white supremacy, and let's not try to wrench it from their hands too quickly. And I'm like, no, let's do that. Let's get rid of that asexually. Let's do that as quickly as possible. Let's start as early as possible, because all that's going to happen as you continue to ingest all of these messages, and as you continue to go through these different levels of socialization, you are going to become more resistant to the truth. You're going to become more resistant to critical thinking. So I think that as soon as you want to introduce your child to reading and literature, period, you should be starting with picture books. You should be starting at the earliest possible to do something to go against what you know is going to be a deluge of negative and racist and prejudicial messaging. You know that's going to happen. You can't undo all of that at once. And so if you think about it in terms of going against the tide, you will understand exactly how much intentionality has to go into this and how much volume has to go into this. We would have to stop allowing certain things to even be published and certain people to even be published for like 100 years minimum before we would even make a dent. So don't be afraid that you're going to suddenly, that white voices are going to be excluded. And that seems to be what people's concern is if we move too fast. You know, we're always concerned about the person who has the biggest meal for some reason, losing any part of it. And so I was in private schooling and in special programs the entire time. And I still would say that until I went to high school and until I was in International Baccalaureate, I was still getting the same messaging. I was still getting the same, and a lot of it is tacit, but anytime we're all reading the same books over and over again, you don't have to have a conversation with me. You are telling me implicitly that this is of value, this is extremely important, and if you don't relate to it and if it doesn't reflect you, you are less valuable. Not the book, you are less valuable. And so being an IB, one of the great things that happened is, you know, you have translated text, you have a whole year that's just translated text from other countries. You have, I read Toni Morrison in high school because of this program. And I realized how rare that was in the 90s, that I would be reading and discussing Toni Morrison as though she was who she was, with an actual reverence and with an actual understanding of her voice and her talent and her craft and her place in American literature and international literature. And that too is tacit instruction and tacit socialization. There's a positive consequence to that. So all I can say is if that had happened sooner, who knows? I think that I've always been a quite self-aware and quite critical person, but I still think, what would have happened if I'd been exposed to these things in junior high? What would have happened if I'd been exposed to these things? Because there were a lot of things that I had to work through and a lot of things that I deal with in so many beginnings, that you don't realize you have this ingested anti-Blackness, that you have this ingested shame associated with being descendant of enslaved people that you're constantly trying to mitigate because you haven't been exposed to the idea and the language that I use in this book, which is enslaved versus slave, where I'm shifting the culpability. This is not my shame, this is your shame. This is an active word. If I am enslaved, it means something was done to me. It's not a trait of my character. It's not a part of my identity. It's an action taken against me. And that means that there is an enslaver. That is the kind of linguistic work that I'm doing in so many beginnings. Again, because I understand and I appreciate the power of that tacit messaging. But I also, as we talked about, really understand that people need to be given context and history in order to properly frame a foundation from which to continue this growth and processing. And so it was extremely important to me to do a discussion guide to go with so many beginnings. I don't want to just give this book to people who are going to put it in the classroom next to Little Women and feel like that's an interesting thing to do. I'm not writing a retelling. A retelling, as I have said many times, is to honor and to celebrate the canon. I'm doing a remix, which is to challenge the canon. By challenging the canon, I don't need you to reintroduce the canon. I'm telling you that I'm trying to displace the canon. The canon has failed. The canon is failing. There is a reason for that, and that it is important to allow this story to exist and to take the lessons and the introduction of excavated history that's involved here. But my discussion guide, which I'm so excited about, deals a lot with language. It deals a lot with the ingested anti-Blackness of some of the Northern characters, Black Northern characters in the story, because it's not a simple conversation. And I don't want to take the chance of just giving this to people who have had the kind of education we know people have had and just assume that they will be able to metabolize this and lead discussions about it. So it's really important to me that when people read this book, they understand that there is a resource that I do intend to go along with this book. And I feel like it's the proper way to start an academic conversation about this book.
And what you mentioned is important. There isn't just one canon. There is the Western canon, which has perpetuated this hegemony of, anti-Blackness and also, this is probably bad to say, but pro-whiteness in a lot of American schools. And so, I want to kind of go over to Dr. Fleming now, because she's got this work that can help us rise up, and that work of not only dismantling or disrupting the status quo is work that is, what you've talked about, Bethany, but I would love to hear a little bit more about how you envision folks using your work in schools to do part of that.
Thank you. Well, there are a few ways that I would envision educators, librarians, and others who are using the book, maybe reading it with young people, reading it themselves, that I think can help sustain an ongoing praxis of anti-racism. One is I want to just give a shout out to discussion guides. So the publisher has put together a discussion guide that is exciting, and I think is going to be a good resource. And also, I can't help it because I am an academic. This book, although it is for young readers, it has almost 400 endnotes, okay? And I don't want to intimidate readers because the endnotes are, I hope they are a good complement to what the text includes, but also like a guidepost for further education. And there are so many, in part because I want to show you my research, and I want to teach you that you need to keep doing your own research. My book is not, I put a lot in there. So my intention is that you learn a lot from it, but it's just one of many, many, many other resources, and not just contemporary resources, but also books, pamphlets by Ida B. Wells, W.B. Du Bois, primary sources from indigenous people who resisted settler colonialism. We have so many historical resources that we need to draw upon. And I hope that, the endnotes in the book are a part of that, and kind of a signal reminder that this is ongoing learning. And the learning is not just about racism. The learning is about fighting white supremacy. It's about promoting human rights and justice, and also an intersectional perspective, and centering the knowledge of Black women and Black feminists who have been so instrumental, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, so instrumental in teaching us how racism is connected to patriarchy and class oppression and ableism and homophobia. So that's also what I hope that the book can do, and that young people can take away from the text is it's not just enough to try to become knowledgeable about racism as one axis of domination. We have to think critically about how racism intersects with these other interrelated forms of oppression. And part of that too is the work of expanding our compassion, expanding our ability to care about the experiences and vulnerabilities of people who may be encountering forms of domination that we're not personally familiar with. You may know what it's like to experience racism and sexism, but you may not be very knowledgeable about how those things intersect with homophobia and biphobia and transphobia. So these are, elements that I interweave in the text, and I try to leave the reader with 5 concrete steps for moving forward. And some of them are the steps I've already sort of mentioned, things like embracing an intersectional approach to social justice. But just to go back to something we were discussing at the very beginning, Julia, when you really set the tone that this is ongoing work, the number one lesson for young people in Rise Up is that we need to make an ongoing lifelong commitment to anti-racism. Like, if young people can learn that, they're going to be ahead of tens of millions of adults who still don't know that. And that's powerful, and that's inspiring. So that's what I hope folks take away from the work in terms of sustaining an ongoing anti-racist praxis.
I really appreciate what you said about the practical steps that folks can take, because so often people will attend webinars like this excited about these works, but then also curious and perhaps not wanting guidance about practical steps that they can take to include them in their curriculum and also to have book clubs around them. So I'm glad that you've provided resources. We got a lot of questions from folks about CRT and about censorship. And I just want to give a shout out to the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom, because there is an intellectual freedom pamphlet and anti-censorship toolkit that are available on that website that folks can get. I know that the International Literacy Association also has a children's right to read poster that I'm going to have all over my school, and I highly recommend that folks grab that as well. Children do have the right to read what they want, and our job is to provide compelling books for them. So access is really important. And then there is, of course, there are statements and different documents that you can pull from the National Council for Teachers of English website that defend independent reading and that also defend intellectual freedom. And of course, there is CART, which is the Committee for Anti-Bias, Anti-Racist Education in the Teaching of English, I believe. But Lorena, a colleague of mine who is part of Disrupt Text, is the chair of the CART committee from NCTE. They also have a lot of resources. So I just wanted to throw all of those out for the folks who are looking for practical steps, but also different resources that could help them in bringing these works into their school settings. Amina, I would love to just kind of shift gears a little bit here and hear from you about two things: the research process in writing your book, and then also, how did you get the idea to take a story that some folks consider to be what, a classic out of, if I'm remembering correctly, England? Did it originate there? And then just flip it. Why, how, and what did you do along the journey to creating this work for us?
Thank you. Yes. Robin Hood is like a tradition of English ballads, essentially Anglo-Saxon ballads, if we're really going like all the way back. Let me just hold on. You let me push my glasses up. I trained as an art historian. So I trained in academia. I wanted to be an art history professor. I love to ask questions. I think that's for me, like the root. It was like when I first saw the question, how do you research? And my first thought is organized chaos. But I think continuously asking questions, and I think this goes back to what Bethany was talking about, what Dr. Fleming is talking about, where learning to think critically and learning to keep asking questions and learning to ask the next question and be comfortable in that discomfort is so central for me to research, where it's like, okay, did women fight in the Crusades? Why do I have this thought about whether or not they could fight in the Crusades? Why did I think of the medieval in this idiom? We often think that like we are more advanced than the medieval idiom. We're always people. That's my favorite medievalist professor was like, we don't think better than people did in the Middle Ages. We just think differently, right? Like we're talking about before secular humanism was invented, okay? Like we just conceptualize the world differently. That doesn't make us smarter and them less progressive than us. That doesn't make the world less global at that time. And I think that has always been my medievalist soapbox, is that the medieval world was incredibly global and incredibly cosmopolitan, especially when we talk about the centers of medieval world, when we're talking about Eurasia, because it is not over in Europe. It's like in Asia, it's in Africa, it's in these different hubs that moved around. These places were incredibly cosmopolitan. They had incredibly diverse and intricate trade networks of people interacting with one another and people working together. So that's, I think, always where I start, where I'm just a big history nerd, and art history in particular is about kind of the history of stories and the ways in which we see them in art. And they always are the intersection point of the individual artist, the culture, the stories we tell, the stories we hand down. My editor, Emily, actually came to me and she was like, hey, we're doing some remixes, sign an NDA. And I'm like, okay, like let's see what it is. And she was like, I'd really love to see what you could do with Robin Hood. And my brain just exploded. Like, I was just so excited because I love the Middle Ages. I love the idea that I get to take this piece of history we have these definitive, basically Game of Thrones ideas about. Technically, that's actually later, but that's like people's idea. It's like, it's Middle Earth, it's Game of Thrones, like that's the medieval period. And it's incredibly whitewashed. It's incredibly sanitized of everything that's intersectional. When we're talking about homophobia and transphobia, it's also been sanitized of like how gender politics actually work and what women could actually do. Because we're always looking through the lens of modernity back at it. So I was just so thrilled to do that. And I was so thrilled to take basically that gallant, chivalrous hero who's always a white man and instead put a young, like, girl of color, a young Muslim a young Muslim woman. And what does that mean? What does it mean if she's classically good? What does it mean if she's classically heroic? What if it means if she's charming and gallant? Like, what does chivalry mean when you like actually think about what that used to mean, which is you own a horse, you basically own a tank or a helicopter, you have different rules you play by. I don't even know if I'm answering the question. I just got very excited. So,
I just like
I just got so excited about history. I was like, I'm sorry, I'm on a runaway train.
I also love history, and so many of our literacy courses are paired with social studies. So they'll do like two teachers will co-teach, and they will have the responsibility for teaching a social studies course that covers the time periods that are in the language arts that the folks are reading at the same time. So totally appropriate.
I think that deepness and that richness is so important to historical texts. And I think the thing that I love about Robin Hood is that it's a story about like vignettes of stories that build to a larger arc. And it's also the time period where these ideas in Europe about courtly love were coming from Arabic and Persian language poetry, and they were directly informed by the Crusades. So it's like the meta level story structure is just as much about the Crusades as the story itself. And then it was fun to play with a story that has been retold and retold so that you get to flip things. Like they finally in the 90s were like, we're progressive, Robin Hood isn't actually racist, he has a Black Muslim friend, here he goes. And then I got to flip that and I got to be like, here's my white himbo crusader, don't worry girls, he's here, he's very handsome. And that was like fun to like take that and like mess it around a little bit. And I think there's always joy in that,
I think that's construction. What a lot of us are wondering is how do you, and you've talked each of you very thoroughly about the process of conducting exhaustive research as part of the process of creating these books and the stories within them and the characters. One of the things that we wonder, I think a lot of us language arts teachers, is why folks come back to the same stories rather than, for example, I'm writing an educator guide right now together with Trisha Abarvia for The Monkey King and Journey to the West. So trying to raise that up as a story that is worthy of academic study. So it's not something that actually has its origins in Western Europe or even comes out of white America, but it's a story that has its origins very firmly in the East. So one thing that I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about before we go into some of these questions from the audience, which, I mean, feel free if you want to choose any of them that really jumped out to you, feel free to kind of weave your answers in. There are just so many, and I really want to take a moment to thank folks for their curiosity and thank them for being willing to explore these conversations and topics, because that is a step in the right direction. And it is the advocacy and the accompliceship that folks from minoritized populations do need or want and expect, really, right? And I just went off on a tangent there, but I definitely would just love to talk just a little bit about origin stories, right? Like, what do you think our young people need to know, what is missing from what you've read, from what you've studied, that should be lifted up or known about perhaps more widely?
Can I also just put an asterisk on this one too before everyone jumps in, which is, sorry, my cat accidentally got shut in this room, so he's gonna be howling. It's almost food time, he's gonna be nervous. The idea of where the stories come from is really important to think about too. Like a really easy example is Gilgamesh, because like we're like, that came from a cradle of civilization and that is part of our story and where we get the medical symbol from. But like we put whiteness on that. We put whiteness on ancient Egypt. We put whiteness on ancient Babylon. And that was like a very specific project of 19th century imperialism. So find news stories, and I want to hear what the other panelists have on that as well, and like lifting up things like the Monkey King, but also think about the stories we assume have whiteness in them or belong to whiteness that maybe don't. And like the courtly love coming in, we're like, it's this medieval European invention. You're like, it comes from Arabic and like Persian poetry, which does like longing and melodrama like nobody's business. Like Shireen and Khosrow is a really good example of two just like the longest burn of all time. So I think ask yourself that too, but I want everyone else to jump in.
I love that. I love that. That is so important. And particularly as a Black American who sees my culture appropriated and then someone claiming it as you know, and then it's like, Black people don't do country music, don't belong in country music, or Black people don't belong in rock and roll. And you're like, oh, sweetheart, beloved, we started this. So just that part of white supremacy, what I say is a tenet of white supremacy, which is greed, the retconning of things' origins and convincing the world that whiteness is the origin of something that it is absolutely not the creator of. So, but that aside, I'm sorry, I just had to comment on that because that is so important to me. I think that something that has happened, and again, I'm usually going to be speaking really specifically to a Black American experience of culture, because that's my imagination, like everyone else's, was not created in a vacuum. My imagination came into fruition in the American zeitgeist and in the culture where I was raised, and obviously some of the other international places that I've lived, but formatively in the United States. And so something that I do see, and I have been a part of this discussion before I did this remix, is this longing for, and this question of, why do we need a Black version of XYZ instead of original stories, instead of allowing Black Americans to have original stories? Why do we need to make a Black version of Captain America? Why can't we? And first of all, I think that's a completely valid question. I think that's a completely valid concern, is this idea that because what it looks like, and what I think white supremacy is then able to respond with is, oh, you're just following after me. You're just coming and, basically doing what they're actually doing, which is the appropriation of people's cultures and everything, and ideas. But one of the things is that we have to, again, with a background in sociology, I think of it in terms of, and especially in this story, I think of it in terms of a Trojan horse. I think of the first episode of Watchmen, of HBO's Watchmen. I think of the first episode of Lovecraft Country. I think of the fact that Black Americans have an amazing tradition of excavating history that has been overlooked and ignored, and Trojan horsing it into a beloved property that people are going to consume, and changing, literally in real time, changing the national imagination, changing our understanding of what is true and what is not true in this country. Because I think the #1 Google search the night that Watchmen aired was, did the Tulsa massacre actually happen? And then with Lovecraft Country, it was like, are sundown towns real? And first of all, I just have to say, part of racism is pretending not to recognize racism. Like, part of racism is denying racism. That's part of the racism, okay? So too many people were involved in these things for everybody to act like they don't know about it, but that's a whole other conversation. But I think one of the things that are so important is using things as Trojan horses and using the reference that has been beaten into us in order to lift up a story that has not, and a history, a lot of times a truth that has not been given space. So I think that's extremely important. I also, of course, completely advocate for completely original work and centering non-white and non-heteronormative stories. But I think that it's both and. There doesn't need to be this. When we think about what the impact is sociologically, I think it is always important to take things from which we have been excluded and make them inclusive and break the back of this structure that we've all been oppressed by and lived under, and infuse it with truth. I think that for some people will always be the entry point. So it's really important to acknowledge when people are saying, like, I want to see our original work, I want us to have original opportunities, but also to understand why it might be important for others to see these properties that have been revered and given a lifespan that really honestly is disproportionate to their importance, and use those very things to talk about things that need to be talked about and expose histories that have been buried.
It also gives you a safe structure, right? Like, it gives you a safe structure to do challenging work because you're not scared of the story, and then you get to dive into some of the critical ideas more deeply. Sometimes that can help people to have footholds that feel safe while doing things that make them uncomfortable.
I am loving this conversation. It's giving me life. I am learning from the three of you. I did kind of type into the chat a condensed version of the original question that I asked, and I'd love for Professor Fleming to give a few words about that, and then we're going to roll over to Q&A from the audience Q&A box. So if folks want to type questions into the Q&A, I'll get to as many of them as we can. I have already put some into our private chat, so Amina and Bethany, if you want to take a look at those, they're there for you, and we will just jump right over to Professor Fleming, please.
So Julia, I'm seeing in the chat the question about Star Trek, and happy Star Trek Day. Thank you, everyone who's in a Star Trek. Happy Star Trek Day. I know the question I see here is when will we get an anti-racist Star Trek book for me? As soon as possible. It's something that I'm really excited to be working on in this next phase of my career, but like a critical race theorization of Star Trek and every Star Trek series. So that's something that I'm working on and hopefully we'll be able to share more about soon. I just wanted to say something quickly, if I could, about origin stories before we get into the Q&A, because in many ways, Rise Up is about challenging the origin story of the United States, right? Because we get this sanitized version of our history. I got it growing up. Most of us probably, in this event, got the sanitized version in the classroom, at least, where the origin of the country is sort of represented as this sort of benevolent pursuit of freedom and, fighting against the tyranny of the British. And the whole slavery thing is kind of brushed aside, or at worst, it's even represented in some classrooms today as having been a good thing for the enslaved. The violence of the indigenous genocide is almost never directly addressed in our classrooms. And so again, you get not just a sanitized version of the origin of our country, but a blatantly false one. We get misinformation, and it's harmful. It's harmful to everyone. It's even harmful to white people to not know the truth about our country's history. And part of what we miss too with this, sanitized mythology of our country's origin, it's the erasure of the anti-racism and those who have been fighting white supremacy, including some white people. Their histories get written out. You don't learn about white people who were willing to go against the grain and against the violence of white supremacy to stand up for justice. And so I think the fear that some people have who haven't really made a commitment to anti-racism is that if we tell the truth about our origin, that this is going to, it's the most terrible thing that could happen. It will create divisions. The divisions are already there, by the way. The divisions created by white supremacy and racism and oppression, they divide us, they cut short entire lifespans, they create intergenerational disadvantage and advantage for those who are positioned to benefit from systemic racism. And so the work of confronting the truth of the past is also about inspiring us to create a better, more inclusive, truly just future. And that requires not just telling the truth about, you know, these forms of violence and injustice, but that's a big part of it, but also telling the truth about the work that's been done by Black people, by Indigenous people, by Asian Americans, by Latinx Americans, by some white Americans, to do this ongoing work of anti-racism and building a more just society.
I love that phrase, the work of telling the truth of the past. That's like,
Yeah.
that was like shivers. That was beautiful.
I love
right?
that. And that
Yeah.
could actually be its own title, right?
Yeah, it is.
Someone
Yeah.
just dropped something into the book drop behind me. Sorry about that. But yeah, that could be its own work right
Well,
there.
it kind of reminds me of James Llewellyn, who just passed, right? The book Lies My Teacher Told Me,
Mhm.
right? That's such a powerful book,
Mhm.
but it's all about unveiling. And I think Rise Up is in that tradition. It's like showing, you know, these are the truths that have been whitewashed and brushed under the rug so that we can be inspired to continue that work in our own lives, in our own communities.
Well, and it dismantles the very kind of the very lazy and facile way that people try to shut down the work now, or the conversations now. They say things like, well, you can't judge them through a modern lens, or you can't, you know, we have to, they were a product of their time. And I say this all the time. My father is 77 years old. He too is a product of a time. He is a product of a time that he was put in the back of police cars as a teenager, driven around the corner and beaten with pistols for no other reason than they saw him walking to school. And no one applies that reasoning to the brutalized. Nobody applies that reasoning. You know why? Because the brutalized aren't out here doing widespread terrorism. But whenever people say this to me, and they say stuff like, oh, well, you have to give them the benefit of, like, you know, you have to put them in the time, and then realize that they were a result of that time period. They were not the only people in that time period. There were people in that time period who disagreed with them at the time. There were people at the time who fought them. There were people like my father who were victims of it. And you don't get to erase the heinous terrorization by saying, well, it was the 50s. And that's why.
And also, like, people can do that work. Like, I have two grandfathers, one who confronted his anti-Blackness having grown up in the Middle East, and like realized when he came here from, well, Iraq by way of Jordan, that like he had anti-Blackness and he wanted to work on that. Like, he was a left-wing, a Marxist. He had, you know, been imprisoned for his political beliefs, and he wanted to do that work. My other grandfather is from Mexico, and he didn't want to do that work. And like, I have to be so honest about both of them, because I see what they were willing to confront in themselves and what they weren't. And you can confront those things even if you are a product of your time, even if you're a product of your time. Yeah.
I just think it's so unfair, because product of your time is never talking about the people who got hurt.
Yeah,
absolutely. They too are a product of that time. And if your children
get to be the subject of their sentences and their own histories and their own oral stories.
And you hear people say things like, oh, well, I don't want to introduce this to these children too young. I don't want to. Well, I had to introduce my son almost from consciousness, because he's a Black boy. If children of color are old enough to understand the racism that they are going to face, white children are old enough to understand the racism from which they benefit, and what their microaggressions contribute to, and where that leads, where that behavior and thought process will inevitably lead. I did see a question for me about the nonfiction I would like So Many Beginnings paired with, and the bulk of, I would say the lion's share of my research, of course, on the Freed People Colony at Roanoke Island was Patricia C. Click's Time Full of Trial. There were a lot of JSTOR articles that I do not have committed to memory, but they also were not as formative as hers. So I would love for people, to take really seriously the discussion guide that is going to be coming out from Fievel and Friends for this book. I prepared that myself. I take it very, very seriously, but I would really love for people to be reading Patricia C. Click's work. That is Time Full of Trial.
Off of that, I had a similar question for Travelers Along the Way, which is what nonfiction book? And Amin Malouf has written he has a fiction book, but he has a nonfiction book called The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, and it is older. So it is older scholarship, but what I really love about it is, first of all, it's like short and digestible, and it's in the same kind of narrative format you get often of the Crusades. Like, I feel like the Crusades, the history itself has been very narrativized and very romanticized, and is in and of itself its own kind of story beyond history. And so this is doing that from a different perspective. And it's also complicating the idea that everyone fighting these like Norman and Frankish invaders were all Muslim. Many were Christian, they were local Georgians, they were Arab, they were Jewish, and they were Muslim, and they were Persian. Like, it's a very complicated idea. And I think that he does a really great job of constructing that complicated idea while making it feel like a clean narrative, which you don't often get in complicated histories. So that's why I recommend that one.
Well, I know that a book list is going to be coming out to everyone who attended this webinar in an email after we are finished. Lots of folks in the Q&A have been asking for book lists, and I want to firmly but lovingly remind folks that when you're looking to a book list, the book list is only as good as the list maker. So, one person asked me one time, why do you want someone else to do the work? And so I want to just ask you that question. Book lists are a great place to start, but eventually you want to be that person who is empowered to make a book list of your own. So you can't skip it. There are no shortcuts. You got to read the books. You've got to be familiar with the history that you all have talked about. You have got to know the narratives and counter narratives. And you've got to be willing to problematize the stories that you are told about not only the people who are, thrust to the center of all literary conversations and lifted up as, these paragons of literary greatness, but also you've got to be willing to problematize the narratives of history and fictional narratives pertaining to marginalized folks and folks who are, not at the center. I mean, for lack of a better way of saying it, we have been marginalized and often erased and silenced, not only in schools, but just in, the work of culture workers, because we know historically folks were not always able to get published if they were people of color. And so we are living in what some have referred to as a golden age for authors of color. You might disagree. You have perspectives that I need to know. We all need to know about. Dr.
We don't get as much gold as the white authors,
okay,
but it might be a golden age of some sort.
That's it. Yes.
It cannot be a golden age. CBC releases numbers every single year. There are more books by and about or about inanimate objects than there are all non-white children.
Oh my God.
There's a lot of work to be done.
So laughing or crying?
What we're talking about is hypervisibility. Yeah. And one of the things that breeds hypervisibility is scarcity. So before you get all excited to say, like, there are non-white stories everywhere, there are Black stories everywhere, there are Muslim stories everywhere, understand that you are seeing 4 and you're not used to seeing 4. Yeah. So you think that that's a golden age. This is not a golden age. We have not gotten there. We have not gotten there.
And even when you look at who is in decision-making positions in the publishing industry, okay, we could talk about authors. We need to talk about owners of capital.
We need to talk about editors. We need to talk about publishers. We need to talk about who am I bringing these books to? We need to talk about the work of authors who are very, very strict with our vision and what that can cost and how many of us can afford to do that. And that is a cat.
Yes, these are things people need to hear. Absolutely.
It's really, really important, because as an author, and particularly as an author who is having any form of success, people very much want to point to me and point to, and let me put it this way. I know most of the other people that you're going to mention. We all know each other. That's how small this pool is. Okay, so very, very important that we look at the actual numbers and we understand that the overrepresentation, because that's what it is, the overrepresentation of whiteness continues unabated. Please do not take hypervisibility as a sign that we have gotten to some special place, because I promise you, it should not have taken me over 10 years to get published the first time. And it certainly should not have taken me several years beyond that to get paid what I am due. So much more needs to happen. And it always bothers me because then you get a lot of people saying, I wish I were a Black woman. It would be so easy to get published right now. Because 12 of us are being published? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Also, like, even thinking about who writes flap copy, right? Like, who's on your, sometimes it's your editor, sometimes it's like who's writing marketing copy, like whose perspective and how they, like, I've had that happen where like they're doing a really great job, but the ways in which people use terms are, my cat is so ready for lunch. But like the ways in which people use terms are different, and like who's in those chairs and what those mean, I think is so important on top of all of the ideas that you're saying, especially with hypervisibility. And also, I think this is the first time I've been on a panel with only women of color ever, now that I'm thinking about it. Like, which has been delightful. I'm just like, my brain's sort of like breaking a little bit. As I'm like, has this happened before?
Problematic in and of itself, isn't it? Yeah.
And this would need to happen, to go back to something Bethany said at the beginning, that would need to happen like for every panel for the next 100 or 200 or 300 years in order for us to maybe legitimately talk about a golden age. So the bar has been so low and so non-existent for so long that the little bit of progress we're making gets overstated.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like 9 women on the court, right? Because
Yes.
we've had hundreds of years of only men on the court, right? What's the number? It's like all nine. All nine would have
to be right. One of the things that we're constantly fighting, and the first book plates that I signed for this book said history over mythology. What we're always fighting is the bent and the desire to mythologize in America. Like, we don't like dealing with facts for very long whatsoever. We like to lionize, we like to mythologize. And even when you're doing it for a different party, it's still not useful because it flattens the narrative, it flattens the work, it gives people an easy out. It's why things don't persist as long as it needs to, because you have this idea that, like, if I do this for 10 minutes, the world's going to be solved. And now this is the new myth that I'm going to tell myself. And that is just not how it works. So I always want to resist against that desire to mythologize in this country.
And I want to recommend that folks follow the work of Dr. Sarah Park Dahlen. She is a librarian who has done a lot of research into exactly the statistics that you were talking about in children's publishing. So please follow some of the colleagues that I have mentioned. Please check out the links that are going to be shared with you in the follow-up email, on the website, on the Twitter. Please purchase these books and read them, talk about them critically, have the conversations, use the discussion guides with young people. And we are here for, continuing and ongoing conversations. And I'm sure you all love school visits. So invite folks to your communities to have the conversations with your young people. All right, I think we did what we set out to do. I hope that is time, and I will bring my own self to a close. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Julia. You accomplished everything you set out to do and more. I just want to thank you all again for this important conversation and sharing these resources. As Julia mentioned, we're going to compile all the links that they were talking about in a follow-up email for you all. This event was recorded. There is a title list with links to more books and more discussion guides. And as they said, this is continuing work. So please share those resources with your colleagues. I hope this presentation has been helpful as we head into the new school year. We're thinking of you all. We know it's a difficult time to be in school, and the work that you do for your young people is just so important. Please visit our website, mackidsschoolandlibrary.com. We also shared some highlights on Twitter today at MacKidsSL, where we have more resources available, and we want to thank each and every one of you. And now I'm going to pass things over to Grace from Booklist for a few final notes for you all.
Grace, just a heads up, you are muted.
Sorry, guys. I think Grace is having some technical difficulties. This is Brianna at Booklist. So I will just close things out. Thank you all so much. This has been amazing. I want to see like a part 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And just some closing slides. So you can check out more about our webinars at booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can register for ones like the ones you saw today or the other events you see here. And we have a special webinar offer going always. So if you're not yet a subscriber, you can subscribe to Booklist for just $75 and get access to our online archives, print magazine, digital magazine, and more by using the special URL you see on your screen at www.booklistonline.com/webinar offer. And we also have a new patron-facing product that just launched called Booklist Reader. That will help you as librarians make connections with your readers. That just launched yesterday. To check that out, you can head to booklistonline.com/reader-issues. And once more, thank you all so much for this absolutely incredible webinar. And thank you to Macmillan Kids for coordinating. This concludes today's webinar, and we can't wait to see you all next time.